Hello everyone, my name is PJ Thum. I'm wearing a green batik shirt because today, 2nd October, is Hari Batik, and I'm standing in front of a pre-colonial map of Southeast Asia. My pronouns are he, him. I want to first thank Tjin and the organizers of the Singapore Literature Festival in New York City for inviting me to speak to all of you today, and I want to thank all of you for joining me. Today, we live in a world governed by three major ideologies which are breaking down: neoliberal capitalism, liberal, or more accurately, illiberal democracy, and nationalism, specifically the nation state as its political expression. And I'm going to talk in particular about the intersection of the last two and the role that we as writers, artists, and academics can play in building a better world. The American diplomat Richard Holbrooke, on the eve of elections which were supposed to restore democracy in Bosnia in September 1996, asked, "Suppose the elections are free and fair. What if those elected are racists, fascists, separatists?" And this is the problem we face. Around the world, we see that supposedly free and fair elections are producing racists, fascists, and xenophobes. The question is, why? If this is what democracy produces, is there hope for democracy? Since this is the Singapore Literature Festival, I want to explain this by telling you a story about Singapore. It's a story that many of you might be familiar with, and some of you might actually have lived through. It's about our reunification with the rest of Malaya in 1963, and what this tells us about democracy and how and why people vote. It's hard to understand right now, but the idea of Singapore as a nation state is a very, very recent one. Until 1957, there was no real distinction between Singapore and the rest of Malaya. Administratively, there had been three different arrangements for British Malaya, and Singapore was governed with Penang and Malacca as the Strait settlements. But for the people of Malaya, Malaya stretched from Singapore all the way to Perlis and even to the Malay states that were formerly part of southern Thailand. Think of how the People's Action Party in Singapore has divided Singapore into these nonsensical group representative constituencies, such as to the result that 6th Avenue is in Tanjong Pagar GRC or Serangoon is in Marine Parade GRC. Maybe to the administrators it makes sense, but to us there's only one government and there's no real impact on our day-to-day lives as we move around. And that's how people on the ground experienced Malaya back then. Federated and unfederated Malay states, strait settlements, whatever, it's one country. There were no borders. Again, this may be hard for us to understand. For most of human history, we've lived in a world of open borders. Permanent border control with passports and walls and security is really an invention of the 20th century, and for most of history, security was focused on cities, not countries. In Malaya, until 1946 and even till 1957, there was no real restriction of movement over the causeway the way we understand and experience it today. And Malayans tended to travel to Singapore in particular. Singapore was the New York of Malaya, of the Malay world, the big city where Malayans would go to find work. Singaporeans had family back in Malaya, in Ipoh, in Taiping, in Kuala Lumpur. We were the shining jewel of the Malay world. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So how people experienced and imagined their home, their country, their identity was very different to how we see it today. And after the partition of Malaya in 1946 under the Malayan Union, and especially after the independence of the Federation of Malaya in 1957, Singaporeans wanted reunification with the rest of their country, with their families on the other side of the border. And so began the campaign that culminated in merger in 1963. Now, the merger campaign of 61 to 63 is really complicated, but the short version is that Lee Kuan Yew rushed into merger because he was on the verge of losing the next elections due in 63, and he wanted something he could deliver to the electorate and also use as a wedge issue on which he could defeat his opponents. Reunification was so popular and so strongly felt, it was perfect for him to manipulate. In order to achieve merger, he was forced to negotiate a form of merger which was highly flawed. Singaporeans would be unequal citizens of the new Malaysia. We were politically quarantined in Singapore, underrepresented in the Dewan Rakyat, and lived separate political lives within Malaysia. In exchange, we had concessions in labour rights, education, and also there was no real agreement on financial and economic arrangements. Now, the opposition Barisan Socialists pointed out that rationally, the form of merger made no sense. Imagine if you and your family lived together in one house, but you could only be treated as a member of the family when you are in your bedroom. The moment you leave your bedroom, you are treated as a foreigner within the house. In exchange, you have greater freedom in your own bedroom compared to everyone else in the house. You can run a shop in your bedroom. You can serve people through your bedroom window. But you still have to pay for your share of all the household bills and utilities and bear responsibility for the whole house. But when the house votes on what to do, you count for only 62% of a full vote. And you will forever be a foreigner outside of your bedroom. So in the short term, maybe you can put up with it, but in the long term, such a living arrangement would never work. But that was what the PAP proposed. And the Singapore public weren't stupid. They knew this was a bad deal. A Gallup poll in Tanjong Pagar, run by a committee headed by Tommy Koh, yes, that Tommy Koh, found that 90% of the respondents were against the PAP's proposed form of merger. Tommy Koh is still alive, you can ask him about this poll. But when the PAP then called for a referendum on merger, they won in a landslide. 70% voted for the PAP's option, while 25% cast blank votes. So here's the question. Why did the PAP win the referendum on merger so decisively, even though the people recognized that the choices in front of them were all deeply flawed? Why did democracy fail to produce an outcome which was actually representative of what the people wanted? And this brings us back to the question about democracy. Part of understanding the outcome is understanding that the whole system was rigged. The parliamentary process marginalized opposition voices. The referendum had no option to vote no. The way the vote was run was very biased. The PAP monopolized the media coverage, all the ways many elections today are problematic, which you're definitely familiar with. And the problem is that we often mistake voting for democracy. Elections are a mechanism through which we can achieve democracy, but it is not democracy itself. Democracy includes rule of law, a separation of powers, the protection of basic liberties of freedom of speech, assembly, religion, association, and so on. Democracy includes values and norms of fairness and justice. And when those values and norms are violated, even by freely and fairly elected leaders, it ceases to be a democracy. Democracy is about the means being more important than the ends. One marker of a democracy, I suggest, is when people care more that the process through which decisions being made are fair and just than the actual outcomes of the decision. All of this was absent in the referendum. So I don't think any of this first point is controversial, as the importance to democracy of the ideas of classical liberalism have been understood for a long time now, but it's important to remember. Okay, but people then could still have cast blank votes. Why did they end up voting for the PAP's option instead of blank votes? And to understand this, I want to focus on another important aspect of that vote, that of nationalism, of identity, and what that means for us today. To understand this, let me reframe the story you just heard in the context of the 20th century, and in particular the concept of the nation-state. The concept of the nation-state arose out of the wreckage of World War I as the great European land empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, were torn apart. And this idea of the nation-state was powerfully liberating by articulating the idea that people should govern themselves. But how do we group people? Well, if everyone has a nationality, if they belong to a nation, and if nations should be sovereign and self-governing, then naturally each nation should have its own state. The problem, of course, is that it's impossible for every nation to neatly map on to every state and vice versa. And over time, autocrats realized that monopolizing control of the definition of the nation gave them power over the state and allowed them to target their enemies within the state as not part of the nation. And then from there, a short step to they are anti-national. And from there, it's a short step to saying they're not just a threat to the nation state, but we need to act against them with extreme prejudice, against all enemies with extreme prejudice, real or perceived. So the nation-state ideal powers the breakup of empires and the liberation of colonies, which then form new states throughout the 20th century. But at the same time, because of this, we also get horrors like genocide. Who belongs to the nation? Who does not? The Rohingya, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Papuans. What nation do they belong to? What state do they belong to? What happens if their self-definition of their own identity is different from the state government's definition of their identity? What happens if my definition of my own identity is different from my government's? In Singapore, we see people who disagree with the government being tarred as anti-national, as traitors, on the most spurious grounds. People like me, just because we disagree with the government. This is the Janus face of the nation-state paradigm. It is simultaneously powerfully liberating and powerfully oppressing. From the fall of the Roman Republic to the beginning of the 20th century, the empire was the default mode of political organization. But within a few decades, by the late 1960s, we were a world of nation-states. And Singapore was no different. From the moment we understood that we were going to be an independent country, we understood it through the paradigm of the nation-state. And the questions immediately arose. What nation? Whose nation? And the answer overwhelmingly came back. The Malayan nation. We are Malayan. But what does it then mean to be Malayan? And this was the central problem, the central contested issue. And the leaders of the alliance government in Kuala Lumpur had a very different meaning of Malayan than most Singaporeans. Heck, the leaders of UMNO in Kuala Lumpur had a different meaning of Malayan from many Singaporean Malays, many of whom envisioned a republic either on par with Indonesia or even rejoining Indonesia to reunite the Malay world and rejecting colonial boundaries. But what was never in doubt for most of our forebears was that they were Malayan. And that is why we voted for reunification, for merger with Malaya. Because we were Malayan. But then why vote for a flawed version? Well, studies have shown that people don't vote purely on the basis of rational self-interest. I mean, they can't. There's just too many conflicting details. Life is complicated. People don't vote on the basis of who the best candidate is, or even usually on the basis of a single issue. All of these things matter. But when you walk into a polling station, you only have a limited set of choices in front of you, and no one agrees with every policy that a party puts out. So what studies have shown is that all of this ultimately is wrapped up in identity. Voters vote as much to affirm their own identity as to make a choice about party and policy. So this helps us understand why people voted for merger, even though they were against the exact form of merger. For them, it was an affirmation of an identity as Malayan, and they could not imagine themselves as anything else, and they voted for a flawed deal because it was the best option that affirmed that identity. And the PAP and alliance governments both said it was the only realistic option for reunification. It was a flawed deal or no deal. They could not imagine themselves as anything else. They were Malayan. But today, many people cannot imagine Singapore having different borders, or indeed, I'd guess that most people cannot imagine their national borders as anything other than what exists today. But we've seen throughout history that national borders are negotiated and constructed, and so too is national identity constructed and collectively imagined. There is no objective reality to national identity, the way, say, a rock is a rock, right? A rock is a rock objectively. But tomorrow, if every Singaporean decided we were not Singaporean, but a different nationality, call it Earthican, then we would be Earthican and no one would know what a Singaporean was. This is the central contradiction of the world today, that we organize ourselves politically on the basis of the nation state, which is predicated on the nation, which is entirely imaginary and subjective. And that gives immense power to those who control that identity. The people who can control the identity of the nation can control the state. That's why the fundamental political contest, I think, of our modern world is not about policies. It's actually about identity. Because today, a vast amount of political power comes from being able to define and control national identity. This is a consequence of over a century of the nation-state ideal. Voting has become very tribal. Voters vote and feel entirely justified in voting on the basis of a very narrow identity that they identify with, even if it then leads to outcomes which may not be rationally in their interest. And this then brings into power leaders who use this fear of the other and exclusionary nationalism to win power. Leaders like Trump and Orban, or indeed Mahathir and Muhyiddin, are natural products of our historical trajectory. They're not aberrations or exceptions. They stoke fears of people who do not fit in with their national identity, especially minorities and migrants. They attach values which support their position to the national identity and attack values which don't support their position as anti-national. So ironically, nationalism, which enabled so much liberation via decolonization, is now a primary justification for oppression and exclusion within the nation states, and it has led our world to being more divided. And the toxicity of much nationalist rhetoric and the politics of fear means that a wide range of issues are now tied to nationalism. Migrants, the dilution of one's culture, moral decay, the loss of economic livelihood, and politicians find it far easier to mobilize voters on the basis of nationalism and fear. So all these important issues become tied to this conception of the nation. And once they win, they can say they have a mandate to ignore the values and norms of democracy and overturn the structures and institutions which protect and promote democracy, because having won the vote, they can claim a democratic mandate to pursue the realization of that identity. So when Obama says vote, he's not wrong, but I don't think he's completely right. He's focusing on the mechanics, but not the values, and I think he's setting up the wrong expectations. Voting is necessary, but it will never be enough. For us, those who want to fight for democracy, the real battle, I think, is on three levels. First, promoting the values that underpin democracy. Rule of law, a separation of powers, freedom of speech, assembly, religion, association, and so on. Promoting the means, not the ends. Understanding that process is more important than outcome. Without these values, democracy would not exist. Second, promoting alternative conceptions of the nation. Our fight is to push back against narrow, exclusionary views of the nation and define identity, national identity, as incorporating ideals of fairness and justice and respect for the individual. Authoritarian leaders love to tie obedience to national identity. They say things like, oh, in our nation, we value society above the individual. These are Asian values, not Western values. It's all hypocrisy, of course. As these people were the same ones who promoted individual rights when we were still colonies, but the moment they got in power, suddenly they embraced the values of their former colonial master and called those values Asian values. But there is a third level, and we have to ask ourselves, can we ever truly escape toxic nationalism as long as we continue organizing ourselves as nation states? So our third challenge is to reconsider the concept of the nation state itself and reimagine better ways of organizing ourselves politically that protect all individuals and treat all individuals with dignity and respect. And this is where we as artists, writers, thinkers, philosophers, academics, this is where we come in. We need to imagine a better world. But just imagining is not enough. We need to then inspire people to believe that that better world is possible. But inspiring them is not enough. We need to then convince people to emotionally identify with this better world and incorporate it into their identity so that it becomes as natural to all of us as breathing. I don't just believe this, I'm actually building a company to carry this out in Southeast Asia. It's called New Narrative. Is there any hope for democracy? Yes. It lies in all of us to imagine, inspire, and incorporate a better world into our lives. Thank you very much.